Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm David Larson. I'm going to call this channel Once and Future Church. We're going to discuss things about Catholicism and religion in general, all kinds of things. We're going to do a variety of types of videos, including things like this, which are reaction videos. Thought to kick it off, I would react to a guy in my area, the Triangle area of North Carolina, who went and visited a Latin Mass. He does a show he calls the Atheist Church Audit, and I've found pretty interesting in the past. So I thought, what better way to kick off my channel than to review his recent video, especially since here in North Carolina, there's been some recent things with Latin Mass going on, being more restricted in the western part of the state by the Charlotte Diocese bishop, who maybe I'll mention this later more, but I used to attend his masses when he was the Duke University chaplain. I didn't go to Duke, but I'll get into that maybe later. But so thought, hey, this would be a good thing good way to kick off my review channel and other things that I'm going to do on Once and Future Church. So here we go. A visit to a Latin Mass.
Hey, boys and girls, friends and guys, dudes and bros. Okay, so I was just reading online about this cool trick that I really want to try. Filioque, filioque, filioque. I was told that if I did...
I think this is why people like this guy. He's just kind of light and goofy, and he's an atheist, and he's going to probably come and tear your church apart, not literally, but he's going to probably critique things at your church, but he does it in kind of a pretty good-hearted and light manner. Filioque, I don't know, he'll probably explain it, but it's kind of something that separates the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Church. It means through the Son, because that was added to the Nicene Creed by the Western Church, meaning the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, but also filioque through the Son. So the Orthodox didn't like that was added. It's one of the things that kind of divides to this day. If they're going to reunite Catholic and Orthodox, probably that will have to be resolved in a way satisfactory to both. But yeah, he's just throwing that out there. Light way before he starts a very, a topic on that's kind of connected to that, a lot of sort of minute details of church history and all that.
I would magically conjure up a comment war between the Ortho Bros and the Trad Caths. If you don't get that joke, it's because you're a Protestant and you don't study church history. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another thrilling episode of Atheist Church Audit. My name is Jared, I'm an atheist, and as per usual, today I went to a church. And I've got to say, you're in for a treat today, because this is probably one of my most requested videos. Because today, I finally went to a Latin Mass.
I'm not all that surprised that the most requested almost is Latin Mass. I feel like, if you look at how many people go to Latin Mass, it's less than 1%. It used to be 1%, and then Pope Francis has started to shut them down all over the place. But that 1%-ish of people that like the Latin Mass, or maybe it's more, but that's kind of what a couple surveys showed. I think it was Pew Research, another one from CARM. They both showed about 1%-ish. But that 1%, very active on social media, and I'm not surprised that they have been pushing him to audit them, although it doesn't always come in your favor when he visits your church. So
Yes, I know your prayers to Saint Monica haven't been answered. The joke is probably funnier than I initially realized, because Saint Monica is the mother of Saint Augustine, and Saint Augustine famously didn't like the Latin Vulgate. So, in order to hear a very old, very traditional Latin Mass, I had to drive all the way out to Greensboro, to Our Lady of Grace in Greensboro. I already said that.
So he lives in the Raleigh Diocese, which is the eastern half of the state. I think he lives in Raleigh itself, where I'm in the Raleigh Diocese as well. But he drove all the way out to Greensboro, which is, I'm kind of in between Raleigh and Greensboro, but it crosses that line into the Charlotte Diocese, the western half of the state. So not sure why he did that. Maybe in our diocese, it's not quite as easy to find.
Yeah, man, this was 3 hours of driving for me. And given how many comments have told me over the past year to go to a Latin Mass, my expectations were pretty high. So finding a Latin Mass to go to is actually really difficult. I figured that most Catholic churches had a service in English, a service in Spanish, and a service in Latin. Instead, I had to go through like a weird auxiliary website to, like latinmasstracker.org or something. And then it's like, okay, well, this church does it on every third Wednesday.
So those restrictions came about kind of because Pope Francis, I believe it was 2021, he put a document, Traditionis Custodes, something like that, that limited the reach of the Latin Mass, or at least it directed the bishops to begin to put in place plans that would limit its reach, which is a very controversial move, especially for the, like I said, that 1% of people who went there every week and are very active online. They have a big part of the online Catholicism comes from that segment. So they are not a fan of that move, but that explains kind of why it's so hard to find Latin. Shouldn't it just be easy to find? Not necessarily. And he probably made this video before Bishop Martin of Charlotte Diocese made it even harder. Now they're consolidating everything down to one spot in Mecklenburg County, I believe, near Charlotte.
Day of the month. This church does it on every first and second Sunday of the month. And then the only church that has a Latin Mass going on today is all the way out in Greensboro. And so when I go to confirm on Our Lady of Grace's website, they actually have like a blurb that says that they can't advertise the Latin Mass. Oh, and there was an extra step in there because when you're clicking through the different kinds of Latin Masses, there's multiple kinds of Latin Masses. So trying to figure out like which kind of Latin Mass I needed to go to was kind of annoying. But we sifted through the weeds and we landed on a Tridentine. Tridentine
is usually how I hear people pronounce it, but it means of the Council of Trent. And I think what he means, I guess there are different kinds, but I mean, there's the new Mass, the Novus Ordo, and that can be done in Latin. So maybe that's what he means is, there's Latin Masses that are just the ordinary form of the Mass done in Latin. And then there are these Tridentine Masses, which is the old form called the extraordinary form now. Some people call it TLM, Tridentine Latin Mass. And, that's kind of, I think a lot of people see that as the purer version, if you're into the Latin Mass. And there's Latin in services, other types of services anyways. I believe the Dominicans also have their own Latin Mass. So yeah, Tridentine. He went to one that I think would be considered, that counts.
I don't know, Mass, because that is the kosher Latin Mass. To kind of set the stage for all of this, because I feel like I have to give a tiny bit of history for this to make any sense at all. Up until Vatican II in the 1950s, 1960s, the Catholic Mass all around the world was given in Latin. So the Second Vatican
Not really, but there's like 23 different churches within the global Catholic Church. And the Western Rite mostly had it in Latin. There are a variety of local exceptions to things and whatever, but then there's also all these Eastern and different rites, like in India and Ukraine. Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. That's not in Latin. That was not in Latin. So not quite right to say that until Vatican II everything was in Latin.
Council is arguably the most impactful ecumenical council that the Catholic Church had ever since the Council of Nicaea. So Vatican II did a lot of things, and it kind of flipped the whole Catholic world on its head and threw them for a little bit of a doozy. So one of the biggest changes that Vatican II introduced was the Novus Ordo. I think I'm saying that right. I don't care. Basically, it
Well, the Sacrosanctum Concilium was the document in Vatican II, one of the dogmatic constitutions, the four big ones. And that was the one on the liturgy. It did not institute the Novus Ordo, though. That came later. Pope Paul VI had his, what he solidified later. I think it was meant to put into place things that were decided at Vatican II. Maybe that's not an important distinction, but it wasn't something that happened at the council.
Stated that the Mass from then on would always be done in the common vernacular of.
I hate to be nitpicky. The Vatican II didn't say everything has to be done in vernacular. In fact, it said Latin should have pride of place. Um, it ended up being that way, but like I said, you could do a Latin mass in the new order, in the new Novus Ordo mass. So, not trying to be nitpicky. He's mostly getting the gist of what happened.
The people. So if you're in Latin America, the Mass is now in Spanish. If you're in Brazil, it's now in Portuguese. And if you're in the United States of America, it's either going to be English or Spanish. Cool, dope, awesome, word. And some people really liked that, and some people really hated that. And so it caused a lot of splinter groups, some of which are still kind of bucking up.
That guy was Lefebvre, like Lefebvre is how it's spelled. He said a lot of splinter groups. That guy was the main one, because if you look at how the bishops voted almost unanimously. There were a couple that didn't vote for Vatican II and that were very not happy with vernacular being allowed. But you could go back all the way to the first United States bishop, John Carroll, Baltimore, and he was saying angry letters almost to Rome, like, this is ridiculous that we have to do everything in Latin in the 1700s. It's been a couple hundred years since Trent. And he would go over like just that it's a language that people don't know out on the frontiers in America, and people are leaving, and just people are not taking this seriously. And then actually when he became Archbishop, he agreed to enforce the Latin only, but he was always having difficulties with putting it in place. Keeping priests doing Latin, because they would often just skip whole parts of the service or do things in English just to make it easier, and so their parishioners would be happy. But yeah, and that, I think if you talk to a lot of people who like the Latin Mass, they have this idea that it's always been this smooth thing that everybody loved, and then randomly, almost all the bishops unanimously kind of went in this other direction. Yeah, that's really not historically accurate. If you look at what people thought of it, it was almost always a lot of pushback, and people wanted to do something different. So Lefebvre, his group, left, and they're SSPX, the Society of St. Pius X, and now there's a splinter off that, the FSSP, that is like in union with the church. Some people in SSPX like to say they're also in union with the church, and they're totally legit. The statements of the recent popes, they've given them a little bit of like, oh, you can do confessions. If you're really in a pinch, you can go to their masses. But generally, they're seen as a splinter group that is not in regular communion with the church. And if you want to be in, obedience to your local bishop, you go to his masses, his parishes, not SSPX. So, but they're not a big group, SSPX. So maybe he wasn't trying to say they're a big group, but he said there's a lot of splinter groups. There's a couple. There's also these people, I don't know. That's a topic for another day.
Against the larger Catholic Church. However, kind of like a concession was made, and the extraordinary form of the Latin Mass is still a valid way to perform the Mass. And I don't really know the politics of like deciding when and where and who gets to celebrate the Latin Mass, but it's much more tightly regulated, and they don't want it to become too popular because they're trying to not make it like a schismatic or a sectarian thing. Like they really...
That's pretty on the nose. That's pretty accurate. I don't think the church would have really cared that much about people going to the Latin Mass, and for a long time they didn't. Pope Benedict XVI, he allowed that, but I think the problem was a lot of people who didn't like Vatican II in other ways, like on the religious freedom or on what it means for people outside the church to be in partial communion, or anybody outside, or they're just helplessly damned if you're not officially in Catholic. People who don't like a lot of things about Vatican II were using Latin Mass as kind of an organizing place. So you go there, maybe they're like, yeah, the Pope, he's technically the Pope. Vatican II is technically a council, but it was kind of pastoral, and that magisterium wasn't full magisterium, and there were no new... They have all these arguments they'll use to why they can ignore the popes and the council and any recent encyclicals. And so they got like 1 foot in, 1 foot out, a lot of these people. And so I think Pope Francis was finally like, we're just going to really limit this. Um, I used to be kind of in that camp. I have the Taylor Marshall and Tim Gordon books to prove it. I used to go to Latin Mass in Raleigh. I used to be kind of in that camp. And from my experience, everybody I kind of the general gist of what the people I associated with, the mentality I associated with, was the church is really not on the right path. It's not the real church. The real doctrines are shaky at best, or they've totally ruptured from the way they're supposed to be. The church was not happy with people with that perspective. I'm more of a Bishop Barron, loyal to the bishops and loyal to Vatican II person now, but I know kind of from inside that is the reason why the church has sort of started to clamp down on it, is they're just tired of saying things as the bishops and as the Pope, and then having a bunch of people say, like, oh yeah, well, you don't have the real Mass, you don't have the real doctrines, and sort of, fighting them from within. You can only do that for so long before the person who holds the keys to your masses just says, yeah, you know what, we're not really into this anymore.
They want the Mass to be done in the common vernacular of the people, in everyday language, but they acknowledge, hey, this is a really beautiful, ancient, traditional form, and we want people who are interested in the history, in the beauty of the tradition, to be able to come and still experience that Mass. It's weird because it's like the Vatican is having to play this weird game where like they don't want to normalize the Latin Mass, but they don't want to get rid of it entirely, but then you're not allowed to advertise it. So it's just kind of a weird little song and dance that you have to do to figure out like where to actually go. Very interesting, super cool. Anyway, let's give flowers where flowers are due. This church, man, woof, what a beauty. It honestly like never ceases to amaze me how many beautiful churches there are. It's also kind of why I'm a fan of like, not building new churches, just consolidate. This building was huge, the architecture was glorious, the stained glass was incredible, but the piece de resistance of this whole thing, the whole reason I'm glad I showed up, was the music. There's this TikTok that I found a while back where this dude was like, if I walk into church and it doesn't sound like I'm about to, fight an epic boss battle, I'm leaving. And babe.
All right, so the music was great. First thing he notices. That is one thing that I really appreciate about sort of the trad movement, the reverence, the seriousness they give to the liturgy. That's why I was attracted to it. It's like, these people take this seriously. They believe in God. They believe it's a serious thing. It's not just sort of us getting together for having an excuse to get together and not take it seriously. And they make beautiful music that worships that God, and they really put some thought into it. And that kind of, I think that, it's a scola, which is sort of a Latin chanting choir. Those are always beautiful. And, I appreciate that kind of music over, I think that the Novus Ordo is often kind of struggling to figure out what to do with music. I almost think they should just do more like Anglican style stuff a lot of times, because it's a very similar service. And Anglican music is great, all these hymns that have been passed down, but often instead, new churches, Novus Ordo churches, which is, like I say, 99% of masses, they do some of these songs that were written right after Vatican II with the spirit of Vatican II that are kind of like, people call them boomer songs. They're not the best. And I think those will die off because not very many of them are going to be in the classics category. A couple of them might be, but all that to say, I'm not surprised he enjoys the music there.
Baby, oof. It sounded like that here. I thought that I was going to defeat Sephiroth right then and there. I thought that Bowser was going to be like giving a piggyback ride to Ganondorf and just coming out swinging. Man, that choir.
One more thing. I do think that lends a little bit to, there's this sense that, sometimes with the Eastern Orthodox or with the Latin Mass, people are kind of LARPing their faith. They're not really focused on the message and the love. They're sort of, I want to feel like I'm a medieval Templar knight. Like he's saying, if I don't feel like I'm going into battle, so he's quoting somebody, then it doesn't feel like Mass. I don't know if that's always the best thing to you know, you want to kind of connect it to your own context a bit, not always be, you know, feeling like you have to be in the medieval ages, that was the real Catholicism, was medieval Catholicism, where if we write a new song, that wouldn't really count or whatever.
Was so well practiced and so ethereal, and the acoustics of the building just kind of made it echo on forever and ever and ever. It was really beautiful. So the building was stunning, the music was stunning. Let's talk about the parts that were less than fun. Man, I forget every time I go to a Catholic church how much kneeling there is. And dude, that is a learned art. I feel like I need a strength and conditioning coach to come and like coach me through it, because I bitched out. You know, you're supposed to like plop your knees on those grubby little kneelers and, you know, sit like a good little boy. And I couldn't do it. I'd be like half-assing it, you know, with my knees kind of like perched on it, and then my butt is, you know, on the pew, and I gave up.
All right, this is kind of like, I feel like this applies to Latin Mass, where people are kneeling a lot more up and down and up and down. That's not really how the Novus Ordo Mass that most people go to. I feel like you kneel twice, unless you want to do some personal time for prayer, but that's not like part of the liturgy. But you kneel 2 times, and they're both kind of in the consecration time, and they're not like super, super long. So I feel like that's something people say a lot is, oh, you're always getting up and down, kneeling, and for like half the service. I mean, I could see that for a Latin Mass, but not really for your typical Catholic church.
Tried. Some of those people, man, like their back is like straight as a board, and their knees are just incinerated. I don't know how y'all do it. Super impressive. The other thing was that, like, for the first 10 minutes that I was there, nobody sat in my pew.
Oh.
I must have stank of atheism. No, I'm kidding. People ended up coming and sitting in the pew. Weirdly enough, the guy who did end up coming and sitting in my pew looked exactly like Jared Leto. And if the music wasn't enough to convince me that I was in some, you know, big, great cosmic cinematic universe, the Jared Leto knockoff definitely did. So Latin masses, just like regular masses, have all the same, you know, theatrics and traditions that go with it. And I don't know what any of these things are called, but I'm just gonna call them what I call them. There's the procession of the cross, where they take the cross around and march it around the church. The priest comes around with some holy water and kind of flicks it at you. And you read along in your little booklet and go through the liturgy, which in this case was pretty much entirely in Latin. I'm just gonna say this, man. The fact that there were so many people asking me to go to a Latin Mass in particular is really interesting to me. So again, I've been to Mass a lot of times. Like I've been to several big Catholic churches, but the fact that there were so many people really pressing for me to go to a Latin Mass in particular was kind of curious to me. To contrast this with my Orthobro audience, they often just say, hey, we really want you to go to an Orthodox service. Whereas the request to go to a Latin Mass feels like, hey, we want you to go to a Mass, but specifically the one that feels super duper old. And I wish that I could say that, like, you know, it being in Latin, you know, changed the entire vibe and feeling of it. But it really didn't.
This is going to be disappointing to some people, I think, because I think when they asked him to go, it was like, yeah, this is the one you got to go to. This is the real uncut, you know, Catholicism, and so we're going to need you to go to that version. Sounds like just basically felt like Mass, but with using Latin. So sorry.
Kind of at all. So something that I've been fascinated about for a long time is kind of the artistic texture of ancient languages. Like the fact that you can't understand what's being said somehow makes it feel holier. It somehow like kindles in the mind the idea that this is somehow true, right? It's not just that it's old, but that it's, you know, the language that our ancestors spoke, and it somehow is more closely connected to the core of our being. It's this primordial language that we're somehow, you know, resonating with, even if we don't understand what's being said. And it also,
I think there's an element of veiling to it, where, you know, in a lot of religious ceremonies and everything, there's layers that get holier as you proceed in. And I think, you know, there's physical veiling, but I think language, using a language that's a holy language, it sort of veils the holy things in a linguistic way, where if you had a guy up there talking really casually in the language that you're used to, that is an unveiling that feels like you're making the sacred more secular, more profane. So if you got to have, hey, here we go, we're this cracker, now it's God. Like you'd be like, nah, that doesn't fit. But if you use certain holy language, it's sort of a way of veiling the two realms of the sacred and the profane. Hopefully that makes a little sense.
Kind of makes us more like superstitious regarding it. Like, think of every trope in a movie where they're like, summoning a demon, or, they're casting a spell or something. It always has to be in a super ancient cryptic language. It doesn't have the same impact if it's just like common English. So like, I wasn't a Harry Potter kid growing up, but imagine instead of Wingardium Leviosa, it instead becomes make that shit levitate. Yeah, even like Yu-Gi-Oh, man. It just wouldn't have hit the same if like all of the symbols and all of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics had just been like English, It just doesn't have the same like cool factor. And if I'm totally honest, I feel like that's the reason why a lot of people wanted me to come see it here. Like, yes, there's this cool traditional element to it that preserves a very old history, but there's kind of like a theological sex appeal to it because you can't understand what's being said. And I think that's fine, so long as people realize that that's what's happening. Yeah, man, and I think I said this in one of my recent videos, but so much of these like audits are contingent on my mood because they're opinion pieces and I'm moody. As I was sitting through the service though, I was honestly like in a really piss poor mood, and I was really planning on like coming home and just bitching about this whole thing because
this is not really going the way I'm sure a lot of the Latin Mass crowd wanted this to go. He's like, okay, your music's good and your church was great, but it's not really better just because it's in Latin. And it sounds like he's about to go in even more, something else that threw him off. He's like planning on just coming back and bitching about it. He couched it a little bit. Like, maybe I was just hungry. Maybe I was just in a poor mood. But the entire time I was there, I was like, I'm going to rip these people new one. So yeah, this doesn't sound like it's going the way that one would hope if you want the atheist church audit to go your way.
yes, it is super cool that they've preserved this very old tradition. This current liturgy is kind of like stamped in time from the 1200s, from what I understand. Like, it was codified in the Council of Trent in the 16th century, I think, but it represents a primarily 13th century liturgy. Super cool. And I love the idea of spirituality and any religious tradition having this long, beautiful history to draw from. Stuff that harkens back to the great cloud of witnesses who came before you. That's always 2 thumbs up. But my reservation with any ancient tradition is the fact that it always runs the risk of just becoming tradition. And I think the most beautiful forms of Christianity, or just religion in general, that I've seen find a way to sandwich together the beauty of the tradition and the very immediate, very real, very personable reality of the religion in your own life.
I will say this for trad type people. I don't know if that's derogatory to some people say trad, but people who really like the traditions and the Latin Mass, they are not just, this is beautiful, so I like it, so I go. Almost all of them that I've ever met take their faith very, very seriously. So I do think it is a group that is taking their very reverent, serious view of a timeless thing that was handed to them, and they want the feel of a similarly very reverent, very holy, very serious liturgy. So I do think there is that match. He's maybe thinking that there's not, but from my experience, I think definitely when I was more trad, man, I took things very seriously in terms of what my life, if you have just a bad thought, maybe that means I'm going to hell right now and I need to immediately find a confession. And it's a very serious mindset you can get into with traditionalist Catholicism. So I'm not sure that criticism lands.
And you find a way to sandwich those two together, and whoop-de-doo, you got a great religious person. Hopefully, maybe. I don't know. So I don't really know why any of that put me in a bad mood. Maybe I just had the idea in my mind, the way in which, some people will like fetishize certain languages or ancient vibes. I don't really know how to describe this, but like ancient languages kind of become their own aesthetic, and like different languages and different ancient customs and cultures associated with.
This guy has a metal band. I don't even know if he has a band, but he at least he makes metal music, maybe even just by himself. I don't know. But he throws in a little bit of that every one. I think he wants to direct people to his music, which is his main thing, potentially. So I respect that. I kind of intend on doing the same thing because I write music, not metal, but I like some Metallica, Megadeth myself. Maybe that's probably before his time, but
Those languages kind of become their own like aesthetic texture. Case in point, like the Black Hebrew Israelites, they get really into Hebrew, and
all right, I'm just saying, this is not going the way of the Latin Mass crowd. Once he's like pulling up goofy pictures of the Hebrew Israelites and comparing Latin Mass to that, hopefully he got something better out of it than that. But he's saying fetishizing ancient liturgy and practices and rituals and languages. So not a great.
they want to read the Torah in the original Hebrew. And in addition to that, they have their own creative takes on like, Levitical garb and stuff like that. But like when you zoom out, it just feels like they're just kind of fetishizing, ancient Hebrew culture. I see all the time, trad caths on Instagram who are like fetishizing
the era of the Crusades and King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem.
And I am 1000% guilty of this myself because I fetishize the ancient Greek culture. I definitely don't write, handmade manuscripts to my Patreon supporters or anything. That'd be stupid. But I think my concern is that like it runs the risk of it kind of becoming more important than the personal spirituality element of it.
This is a great insight I think he got, and I think that's true. That you can get really wrapped up in the aesthetics of something and how it feels, and that I am good with God and I am holy because listen to that music. Look at these stained glass windows. Look at this liturgy, how serious it is. Everything is good. And you don't get into the here and now application, which sounds a little different than what I said about how seriously they take it. I do think they take it seriously. But some of the very spiritual love, like if the law of love is the law of the new covenant, you can ignore a lot of the details of the Mosaic law, and it's about loving God and loving your neighbor. That you can find pretty absent in some trad culture online, especially, where it's like, okay, if that's the main law of the new covenant, it's the law of love. Are you all doing that one main thing? Are we actually doing that, or are we just, oh, this feels so cool, and the smells and the bells, and which I really enjoy that part about reverent liturgy and all that. But I think he's onto something a little bit here.
Seem to be the sense of kind of like, oh yeah, this is like the cool kid club. This is refined Catholicism, the OG Catholicism. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm just an asshole contrary.
he's like mocking them there. This is not really going their way. He's like, oh, the cool guys, the real Catholicism. I do feel like that's a thing though, where like a lot of the trads would be like, we have the real doctrines, we have the real liturgy. He's not wrong there. I mean, you look at what Catholicism, the main basic principle, of following the magisterium and your bishops, that should be more important than this was formulated a certain way 500 years ago, and now it's formulated differently. I'm going to ignore the actual today Catholicism and hierarchy, and instead, I don't really believe that you can make these two different statements cohere, so I'm going to ignore things that are being said now by that same magisterium. That's not a very good Catholic attitude to have, and I don't think it's defensible. It makes sense to me.
And the fact that people asked me to go do this makes me spiteful and made me not want to go. No, the other thing that kind of put me in a bad mood was the priest's homily, because like all of this is so beautiful and it's so lush and it's so glorious. And then the priest's sermon just fell flat. You know, Catholic homilies are always really short. They're like 10 or 15 minutes. And he like, you know, cracks a couple of jokes about, well, you can binate and you can trinate, but you can't fornicate. And then he spent like some time talking about Tom Brady.
Yeah, that's corny.
And how like Tom Brady got divorced from his wife. He said something along the lines of like, well, you know, Tom Brady spent all this money on his nutrition and on his diet and exercise regimen. But, you know, at the end of the day, he divorced his wife. What does a man profit if he gains the whole world but loses his soul?
All right, that's actually a little bit better than the, I've been to Latin masses in various places. Often that guy at least sounds like he's trying to connect at some sort of human level. I have got more of the curmudgeonly, just uptight, like, you know, you're trying to create this perfect liturgy and this perfect everything, and more of just like you got the impression that this guy's really annoyed with everybody and with how we're living and that was more the impression I got from Latin Mass homilies. If they really put much thought into it at all. Sometimes they even skip them. I don't know. But this guy sounds like he maybe tried to connect, but it was in kind of a finger wagging, oh, I'm going to mention Tom Brady and do a pun joke just to make people pay attention and be, you know, connect with people, but then also just be a little finger wagging. So it sounds like this guy didn't appreciate it too much.
Let's pray for him. And two things. One, I am petrified of becoming someone's sermon illustration. And I know that it's happened before. And if you're a pastor watching this, stop it. I just hate the tone of this kind of like finger wagging and like, come on guys, let's do better. Because just like the atmosphere in the room, it felt like all of this is so incredibly beautiful and it should inspire you to a life of piety and generosity and love and compassion. And instead, in a lot of the Catholic churches that I've visited,
generosity, love, and compassion. So I think, you know, that's kind of one expectation of what religion would do. And that's like when I was saying that the trads take their religion very seriously. I don't think you can say they don't take their religion seriously. They just don't always, they focus more on the justice side, the rule following side. And then if you break some of their rules or their holy thing, you know, taboos, that's why you see them get real nasty online. So yeah, I think that does seem to match kind of my impressions.
It just kind of feels like a cultural custom that a lot of, you know, kind of casual Catholics go to and appreciate. And they're like, oh yeah, it was cool. Give a round of applause for the, you know, 800-year-old history. And the priests either seem bored or they're a little bit more conservative and they're trying to like rally the troops. Like, come on guys, let's not fornicate.
I don't think that's totally fair because in my experience, there's multiple. It's not just people who don't care and people who are, you know, rule followers and trying to shame you. I think there's also a lot of converts from evangelicalism that are very passionate and you know, focused on love and focused. So he's trying to paint all of Catholicism kind of in these two camps. I think there's quite a few more because you have the more progressive types, you have the more trad types, you have maybe the loyal but conservative center, which is where I find myself, and also I feel like Bishop Aaron types who really do care about the love and generosity and you know, do want to give a sermon. When you listen to Bishop Aaron's sermon, he's not doing either of those things.
And I don't know, man, it just like bummed me out because I know that there are super pious and super devout Catholics in that church. And to be totally fair and transparent, I've met very passionate, very on fire Catholic priests. I'm friends with some of them, y'all rock. But I think culturally there's something going on where like the Orthodox are experiencing a revival, and it's this cool world where like it is this very ancient tradition, but in addition to that, it's very personal. Whereas like, honestly, oh man, you guys are gonna hate this. Oh, you're gonna crucify me in the comments. I see a lot of similarities with Sunni Muslims and with American Catholics. Because for a lot of average Sunni Muslims, they're not super passionate about their religion. It's their whole milieu, it's their whole world. And some of them will become.
I got a couple of things on that. First, I don't think that the Orthodox are experiencing some huge revival and the Catholics are not. I think there's actually a ton of converts to both, but I would say far more to Catholicism on a percentage basis, maybe more to Orthodox. But Eastern Orthodox are like 1% maybe of Americans. There's not many. So if they get an influx of converts that's even worth mentioning, it's going to feel like a ton, whereas Catholicism is the largest denomination in the country. So if they get 20 times more than the Orthodox got, which I would suspect they did, it might not even make up for the more casual, Catholics that are starting not to go to Mass and all of that. So that's the first thing. And the other thing I was going to say is we are very individualistic as Americans. So I feel like you can look at something and say, oh, that's cultural to them. Therefore, it's not that important, or therefore it's, not very personal to them. And that's a very American idea of like splitting yourself to that degree from your culture. Whereas I think, if you have some Filipino Catholics or some Nigerian Catholics where it's extremely ingrained in their culture, that doesn't mean they don't take it that seriously. In fact, there are some of the cultural expressions in those places, like the Philippines, they'll like crucify themselves at Good Friday and stuff, not in a way that kills themselves, but that's some very intense things, and they really take their religion seriously on a personal level, even though it's also very ingrained in culture. There are some ways that the people who don't take it that seriously, they're still kind of walking through motions. And is that good or is that bad? Is it better to where you have the people who take it seriously, in both of those camps, if there's culture there and if there's not, are taking it seriously? But is it better for the people who aren't taking it that seriously to, in the strong cultures, to walk through the motions? Or would it be better if they're like Americans and like just shrug it off and not go? So I kind of would lean toward the latter, that having a culture with, having it that embedded and ingrained in a culture is good, because, when maybe something changes in their life and they need an answer, it's there and they can remember it, and maybe they'll have phases where they take it more or less seriously. So I don't necessarily think it's bad, like he's saying, to have a more cultural expression. Also, the Orthodox are not evangelicals where they just, it's all personal, me and Jesus kind of thing. They're a very cultural faith. So a lot of times people actually have more of a complaint about them, where if you convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, I've had a lot of people who have then converted to Catholicism later because they found in Eastern Orthodoxy it can become kind of a culture club where, you have, they all spoke Greek and they all got together and made these Greek pastries, and me, walking in, a tall blonde person, people looked at me as kind of odd. Whereas if you go to the Catholic Church, a lot of it, especially since Vatican II, they're trying to find a way to help you participate, to make it sort of applicable to a variety of people. So, there are a variety of Orthodox churches, but they're usually like, this one's for Arabic-speaking people, the Antiochian, from Syria. This one's for Russian-speaking people. This one's for Greek. So I don't know if I buy that criticism there.
Because for a lot of average Sunni Muslims, they're not super passionate about their religion. It's their whole milieu, it's their whole world. And some of them will become super pious and get really into it. But, for most people, it's just kind of their life. And my hunch is that a lot of the imams have kind of the same timbre in their sermons as Catholic priests do, where it's like, come on, guys, we got to take this seriously. Let's, come on, perk up and try to live holy. And to dish it out to the Orthodox as well, my hunch is that in, traditionally Orthodox communities and countries, it's going to be the same thing there. But here, because you have a slew of converts to Orthodoxy, it's fresh and new to them, and they're super zealous for it, and they're passionate. And then with, kind of liberal or progressive.
That is not, I've been to Orthodox churches when I was trying to decide, coming from being an atheist and rebellious youth to Christian, and I went to Orthodox, I went to Catholic. that was awesome, whatever that was, that Orthodox church. That's not what you're going to find usually. I don't know where he took that clip from, but it's often pretty like rote memorization, chanting. There's no pews in there usually, so that was accurate there. But um, again, I don't see there's this distinction between the Orthodox, which are having a ton of young male converts, and the Catholics who are not. I've seen articles saying there's a lot of young male converts to both right now, Catholic and Orthodox. So I think they have a similar appeal to people in history, tradition, all of that. And there are not Orthodox churches in every town. You're going to have to travel pretty far usually to find one in Randomville, USA. So
of traditional denominations, your Episcopalians, your PCUSA, your United Church of Christ. With them, they do feel super passionate. It's just that they're not passionate primarily about the history of it, and they're not super primarily passionate about the rule keeping. They're predominantly passionate about, living Christ-like. If I'm totally...
That's more what I think progressive Catholics are like, which I have criticisms of that too. As I have criticism for both, right and left, I guess. But I do think the progressives often, they don't really care a lot about the rules. They don't really care as much, I should say, about sticking to old liturgical traditions and all that. They want to, if you go to your Catholic charities or you go to your, local, social justice group for the Catholic Church, it's going to be a lot of very similar types of people to what you'd find at an Episcopal or PCUSA, United Church of Christ. I hope a little more conservative on doctrine, but sometimes not so much.
Honest, I still just kind of feel this like tension and this, I don't know, problem with kind of casual Catholics. I'm a quarter Italian. I'll give myself this pass. It's like the big Italian family. You watch football, you go to church on Sunday. And it's just kind of like a cultural thing rather than like a deep-seated spirituality. Going to church is like a family affair. You wear the crucifix and it kind of looks cool, but you're not like parsing through the book of Galatians every Tuesday night trying to really figure.
I can totally see why he feels this way, because watching a couple of those older videos, he was talking about how he's from a Pentecostal background. And so I could see how that would seem very inauthentic to him for all the, there's some big Catholic, Irish or Italian family and they're, not taking it super seriously. There are a lot of people like that. But there's not very many Pentecostal people like that. You're kind of either all about it, speaking in tongues, or you're probably going to be a little scared of it and walk away. So with his background and before he became an atheist, he was in a pretty wild, like Pentecostal environment. I can see where he's coming from with that. But I would say, I know a lot of people he's saying, thumbing through the book of Galatians. Sure, there are a lot of cultural Catholics, but the people I know at my parish, a ton of converts, first of all, but there's also a ton of groups. There are people who thumbing through Galatians that are doing the Bible in a year with Father Mike Schmitz. That was the most listened to podcast in the United States. So there's got to be some Catholics out there interested in the Bible. So
figure out how Paul wants you to live. You're partying, you're sleeping around. It's just kind of a casual thing, And I think I used to have a lot more resentment for those types of casual Christians than I do now. And I think that was primarily rooted in my own vestigial, austerity. I don't know, something like that. So I think I'm here for all of it. And I think that this is a really cool service and a really cool tradition. And I love all of it.
But
I would just caution people that don't let the form factor be the thing that takes precedent over your spirituality and your personal walk with Jesus or whatever.
So that's a great message, it's a great insight. So I do think, as I was saying earlier about the law of love being the law of the new covenant, that we aren't bound to the old Mosaic laws, but we are bound to the new covenant of loving each other, loving God, loving neighbor, loving self, your enemies. And that, if that's what Jesus said, forgive and you will be forgiven, show mercy and you will be shown mercy. And a lot of his parables had to do with whether or not you were forgiving others, or like the unmerciful servant, things like that. That seems to me to be core to Jesus's message. So I think what he's saying, don't get too obsessed with, is it in Latin? Is it, am I going to be angry all day online, just yelling at people that the mass wasn't traditional enough and all of that, focusing on that rather than, okay, what is this religion actually about? Like, what was Jesus trying to say? Because you missed the whole message because you're arguing about a liturgy. I think that's kind of what he's getting at, and it's a good point.
And don't let the pride of feeling like you have a more traditional or historical form of faith take precedent over loving God. Oh, little atheist preaching a sermon. Oh, like, the heart of the matter that I'm trying to get at is this. For people who are really passionate about the Latin Mass,
I just saw the word vasectomy. I won't bother rewinding it, but that there's always little like clips, little words jumping around his head that if you pause it at just the right moment.
does the Latin Mass make you a better Christian? Does it make you love Jesus more? Does it make you love your neighbor more? Does it make you more contemplative of God and the gospel and Christ's crucifixion? Or is it just like a cool added texture? Does it just sound cooler? Or potentially even worse, does it just make you feel more prideful? Like, oh man, thank God that, we have the traditional Latin Mass, codified in the 1500s. You can just hear the holiness dripping out of the liturgy. Whereas those idiot Baptists down the street, they do their shit in English. And that's like such insane hyperbole, and nobody actually thinks or feels that way. But I feel like I need to parody it to just make it super obvious what I'm worried about taking place. Now, if you can say in transparency and in honesty that the fact that it's in Latin reminds you that this is not a, predominantly American religion, it's not white Jesus riding along in a Cadillac, and the fact that it's in Latin reminds you of that and reminds you of, the incredible history and lineage from the apostles down to the modern day, if it being in Latin reminds you of all of that, wonderful, beautiful, send it. But if it just feels like a theological accoutrement that's going to make you more prideful, then I would question its utility. Because
Yeah, he's repeating that point a little bit, but I think that's smart. And I would say he's saying, nobody actually thinks like that. I think if you get into some of the trad discussions on Twitter, there are some people that it's spiritual pride, which he said he was warning against. He could see the danger of that immediately from this one experience. Yeah, I think he's more than hinting at it.
Again, it's not like you don't already have Mass, right? It's not like you don't already have the Eucharist. It's not like you don't already have the communion of the saints. And I'm probably making like a way bigger deal out of this than I should be. I think it's literally just the fact that so many people were begging me to go to a traditional Latin Mass that it made me feel like, do you guys not think that the regular Mass is sufficient? So yeah.
No, many of them don't. They will say the Novus Ordo is spiritual death. I've seen people say, a lot of these are anonymous accounts, so who the hell are they? I don't know. They might be, like a troll that doesn't really believe it. But I've also seen some legitimate people saying the usual Mass, as he's saying, is not really spiritually good, or even that it could be harmful to you to go to. So the answer to that is, yeah, they don't. Some of them really don't.
Yeah, I don't know, man. It's late. It's really late.
He feels
it was
bad
good.
now.
It was good. But not great. I don't know. I think it was great. It was good. Made me happy. Yeah.
It wasn't great, but it made me happy. But I've been pissed off. He feels bad. I think that he took so many shots and critiques at the Latin Mass. I don't feel bad.
So, anyway, I don't know. Maybe this was a nothing burger. I've got some big crazy churches that are on my radar. some real whirlwinds that I'm really excited about. So those are kind of top of mind for me right now. I apologize if this is underbaked. But anyway, my name is Jared. I'm an atheist. Go to church.
All right. Well, that was quite interesting. A lot of similar themes popping up throughout. He liked the aesthetics of it. He liked the stained glass in the church and the choir, and even some of the history and the tradition there. He thought was pretty cool. But he saw also a lot of risks to making this your thing. That let's see if I know how to move this above, and will that make me bigger? Can I do that while I'm? Nah, I don't know how to do that. Will this change it? I'm just learning this, so let me put myself front and center here. But yeah, he saw some risks and kind of concerned that people could have a spiritual pride around, ooh, this is an old Latin, this is an old service. So it's more pure, and people go to the other ones aren't as great. All that stuff. So that was his concern, and people neglecting then the very core of the faith, which he was like generosity, compassion, love, yada yada. Some people in the trad world, and I think I would agree that that's not all that Christianity teaches. You also do have some moral laws to follow, that you can stray from the faith by being too harsh and not merciful enough, but you can also stray from the faith by not living a just life and living the rules of ethics, sexual ethics, all kinds of different things. So, but I do think he hit on a lot of good points there. And I will say, when I was first being introduced to Catholicism, I totally forgot this. It was by people who brought me to a Latin Mass maybe a couple times in Grand Rapids, Michigan, when I was in college. And I will say I probably had a very similar experience, and I didn't think much about Catholicism for a little bit after, until I started going to a Novus Ordo. So I think there's this impression that a lot of the people who invited him to this Latin Mass have, where if you just get them in the door of a Latin Mass, you know what? That's really what counts. They're going to see how holy it is, and they'll become Catholic. Don't let them go to those Novus Ordos. He kind of had the opposite experience. Honestly, I did too. I went and I was like, everybody seemed really serious and very devout, but also it was a little esoteric, a little like, what are we doing here? It just seems sort of random. And all right, now I'm saying these words in Latin, but what do they mean? It means this thing. Okay, cool. It wasn't very intuitive, and I didn't really get much out of it. And I started going much later, like 15 years later, when I shifted more into a trad phase, a trad understanding. But what actually converted me was normie Catholicism, and then I kind of spiraled maybe more into like more and more conservative, till I thought the trads probably had it all right, and then took a couple steps back the other way. But all that to say that the impression that a lot of people get from a Latin Mass is not always this angelic chanting with Templar knights holding their swords and walking around, and this holy experience, like out of body experience. It can be a lot of different experiences of it. And as if you research what people thought of the Latin Mass before the Mass of Pope Paul VI was implemented, there were a lot of people that were not that happy with it, that did not enjoy it. A lot of people left the Catholic Church over the centuries, and you saw in early America, the bishops were like, people don't like this. Can we please have an exemption and do things in English? So it's a bit more complicated, obviously, but I think this is a valuable impression that was given on him, or a valuable insight that he got, that should teach some people a lesson, that not everybody who goes to a Latin Mass, even one that has beautiful music and a sermon that looked like it was a little more trying to be relatable than some that I've seen, it's not going to be the silver bullet that you think it is. So thanks a lot. Yeah, it's my first video on this channel. not probably going to do a ton of reaction videos, but sometimes I thought this is going to be probably really good. Let's do that. But I'm going to do a lot of other things. I'm going to walk through the Vatican II documents actually, bit by bit, just to give kind of a good idea of what these changes were, what they meant, why did they happen, do kind of a deep dive slowly through all of them. So that'll be something to look forward to, I'm sure, if you're just some kind of sadist. But all right, thanks a lot, and until next time.